the talk could be looked at as somewhat of a sequel to last week's talk about nuclear weapons. I think Tim's presentation, though, is really going to be more about situations where these countries and these actors have not had access to nuclear weapons. He's got some really interesting anecdotes that he could talk about. In fact, I'm certain he could talk for about 2 hours and we wouldn't mind. But I'm going to try to just be very short here because I heard the video of last week's presentation and I realized that I still have remnants of a Boston accent.
Yeah, remnants.
So I'm not going to say anymore. I'm going to turn this over to Tim.
Thank you very much. Is this working fine?
Yeah.
When John said, I'm inviting you to a trust talk, I said, I can trust that this will be the last talk you ever invite me to. So it's a pleasure and honor being here. I had the pleasure of being in the audience in the spring when I was visiting John and Jane to hear one of the talks. And you'll see that my Boston accent also comes out. It comes out when I'm tired, I had too much to drink, or I am around John. So I want to thank the folks who invited me here, Sandy, JJ, John, and others, and Chris. And I'm told that I have to wrap this up in terms of the presentation in 40 to 45 minutes because people by 7 start moving in an exodus out. So I'll be respectful of that. So let me tell you a bit about my background and the background of the organization that I founded and run called Beyond Conflict, and I think why it may be relevant to the conversation this evening. So the background is, I like to tell people, unlike John, by the way, if you know John, he is the oldest of a large family. I am the youngest of a large family, which means I have a problem with convention and authority. John, as you know, is a pillar of respect and authority. And I tell you that not to poke fun at John, but to say that I realized in my late 20s and early 30s that by sort of nature, I was always asking the question, what is missing? How do we do things differently? How do we challenge a certain convention and authority? And it really first expressed itself outside of the home when in the late 90s, 1990, 91, I had a chance to go to Eastern Europe. So we're of an age, it's really funny, when I tell people about the end of the Cold War, they start Googling when that was. So it's actually great to talk to an audience who remembers the Cold War. So if you remember in 1989, 1990, you had all these transitions happening in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, where 70 years of communist dictatorship was falling. And then all these new democracies were emerging. And so there was a lot of interest, a lot of money, and a lot of focus going to help these new democratic countries make the difficult transition from dictatorship to democracy. And there was a lot of expertise and resources going into these countries to help them think about how do you build democratic institutions? How do you write democratic constitutions? And how do you build market economies? So at that time, I got a fellowship to go to the region and spend 2 or 3 weeks. And I had the real privilege to meet a number of dissidents who are now running a lot of post-communist countries. So literally from like 27, 28 countries in Europe, these are people who had spent time in prison, had become bricklayers because they were forced into prison or this sort of work, who were ministers of defense. They were ministers of finance. They were parliamentarians. They were chiefs of staff to new heads of state or heads of government in the region. And I asked them, it gets back to being the youngest child. I said, you have all these experts coming in, but I'm curious, how are you dealing personally and as a community with the legacy of repression? How do you deal with the legacy of decades of keeping your head down, of state repression, of torture, of collaboration, of all those things that dictatorship does to people? And what the response was is that's a really important issue for us. We have a lot of interest, we have a lot of people coming to our region, but when we talk amongst ourselves, those are the conversations we have, because we know what it feels like to struggle with this. The struggle of coming out of a really sort of traumatized life, family, community, and then trying to make that transition. So I had this notion, wouldn't it be interesting to bring together a lot of the new leaders of these post-communist countries, not with experts, nothing wrong with experts, I guess technically could be called an expert these days, but with people who themselves had struggled with the transition from dictatorship to democracy. So in 1991, how many examples did we have? Now I can do it with this audience. How many examples of countries that really tried to navigate the transition from dictatorship to democracy one could look at in 1991? 20 examples, 2 examples, 3? There was less than 5 compared to today. There was the transition in Argentina and Chile after the collapse of those dictatorships in the 1970s. There was the transition from Franco in Spain to democracy. There was denazification in Germany at the end of World War II. There was, some stuff that happened in Greece, remember the dictatorship and the colonels and so forth. So in 1991, if one wanted to find examples and not meet academics, but people who themselves struggled with the transition from dictatorship to democracy, we had less than 5 countries to look at. So I said to this organization called the Salzburg Seminar, you should do a special session, bring together for several days a lot of these new leaders, but with people from these other countries that struggled with this change. And they took a very bureaucratic approach, and they said, well, it's a great idea, but we don't really work that way. So I wrote up this notion of a meeting, and I said, if I can get the funding, could we do it back here in Salzburg? And they said yes. And I said, next question, who can I go to get this money? And a person I had never heard of at the time, he said, you should go see this guy, George Soros, in 1991. And this is before he became famous really for his philanthropy. And so he was born in Hungary, and then really started focusing a lot of his philanthropy in the transition to democracy. So I go knocking on his door literally. This is before email. Had an introduction. I realized, I said, this guy has money. There was a Monet on the wall, a Picasso. And I said, I have this crazy idea. I want to bring together people like Vaclav Havel, or these less famous former dissidents who are now in these countries struggling with change, to hear from people from these other countries. And he said, to his credit, that's a great idea, I'll fund it. So I was like, oh, okay. So I spent the next 8 months reaching out, networking, figuring, all right, who has the expertise for some of the issues? Where do I find these people in other countries? And luckily, and I think through a lot of hard work and networking, ended up organizing about 9 months later a conference back in Salzburg in February of 1992 that had about 120 leaders from about 40 countries. So President Alfonsín, who was the first democratic president of Argentina after the collapse of that junta, was there. Adolfo Suarez, who was the first prime minister of Spain after Franco died, came. If you remember Telford Taylor, the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, he was in his 80s and he came. We had like an incredible group of leaders from a number of countries come, and an incredible group of leaders from these post-communist countries came as well. And the big challenge I had was trying to convince people who were experts in rule of law, constitution writing, human rights, how people in Eastern Europe can learn from people from Argentina, Chile, and Spain. Now you may sit there and think, well, that's ridiculous. Of course people can learn from others, right? But a lot of very quote-unquote sophisticated people were telling me there is no cross-cultural learning. How can somebody that was in East Germany learn from somebody in Argentina? I said, number one, you've never met an Argentine. Second, they would be absolutely outraged that you said that. But intuitively, I felt like people don't respond to the legacy of repression through their national identity card. They respond as humans. Now, I'll get to in a bit some of the work we do in brain and behavioral science. But it's pretty obvious that, we all have the same brain. We all know what humiliation feels like, repression feels like, shame feels like. It's not confined to, to geographic political borders. It's a human experience. And this is what a lot of these people were struggling with. And so that was the big challenge with people from, let's say, the United States and Western Europe. Then the challenge, once we convinced people from those countries to come, was they would think, well, our situation is so unique. How can we learn from others? Nobody knows what it's like to suffer. Nobody knows what it's like to be a victim and keep your head down all the time outside of Eastern Europe. So did they go through that in Argentina and Chile? Did they really struggle with that in Spain? And what I was able to do with the support of other folks is convince this incredible group of people to come together in Salzburg in February 1992. And what I thought would be a one-off conference has grown in not only to our organization, where we have worked in 75 countries around the world for nearly 30 years, but a whole field of transitional justice and other mechanisms and approaches grew out of that meeting and some of the early work we did. And it really focused on the simple proposition that people can learn from the experience of others, that people have to figure out how they deal with their past in order to move forward, and that you can build all these institutions, but if people don't have the culture of democracy, or the culture of being a citizen, or the feeling like, yeah, this works for me and my community, then those structures and institutions really don't have credibility. And so what we found is that in the beginning, people started hearing and seeing those connections. Now, I'll give you a few examples. So in this first conference, you may have read of Samuel Huntington. He was a political scientist at Harvard. He wrote some really important books on the nature of dictatorship. And he's a pretty blunt guy. So he was saying in his presentation at this conference, all the leaders, the names of leaders who he thought did a horrible job. And one of them was Alfonsine, who he didn't realize was 4 people down. And what was interesting is, I overheard the new head of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, which is in the news a lot lately, leaning over to the head of parliament, talking to somebody from Russia at the time, and they were trying to get a translation of the word compromise. And Alfonsine finally said, you know, in Spanish, he had a translator, when we say compromiso, it means, I guess, a commitment, but not like a give and take. And then you can hear all the translators speaking and trying to translate Spanish and Huntington talking about compromise into about 12 different languages, and they didn't know how to translate compromise. And what does language reflect but experience? How often do our dictionaries get updated? Our encyclopedias get updated because we develop new words. But in that meeting, I sat there and I thought, that is that critical moment when all of these people had no clue what compromise meant in, let's say, the American English definition of the word, which is a give and take. Because it's not part of their historic experience. To compromise is weakness. To compromise is giving in. You get nothing in return for doing that. It's an us versus them mentality. It takes a you and I mentality to believe that compromise is something you can do and come out the other side. Which, by the way, is one of the struggles presentation I'll give, we're facing as a country here today. With all the profound differences which are inherent in any democracy, in any society, when people say, yeah, we can have profound differences, but we're still citizens of the same nation, that's a you and I sort of social contract. But it's like that represents a threat to my very identity and a contest over who defines citizenship. It becomes an us versus them. And what was interesting, in 1991, in all these countries that were coming to democracy, they didn't know what compromise meant because they never had a you and I mindset. It was always us versus them. And so at that moment, you know, literally Vaclav Havel and all these other funders, it's great. I'm sure there are a few entrepreneurs here, but you know, it's always great when you come to the market with a new idea and the investors in the room. So I had the head of the German Marshall Fund, I had the George Soros was there and a few other donors, and they said this needs to continue. So long story short, from that first conference, started working throughout Eastern Europe, started working in other countries, because if you remember at the end of the Cold War, there was this sort of ripple effect. The end of the Cold War meant that the Afrikaner state could no longer say that Soviet-style communism represented a threat that we had to defend against. Or that in El Salvador, George Bush and Jim Baker were going down and saying, now we need to negotiate the end of the Salvadoran conflict. Or in Northern Ireland, they started talking about now we need to have a peace process. And then, of course, the release of Mandela and then the negotiations in South Africa, led to a really profound transition and transformation. And so, we came into, I hate to use this because it's not to cheapen the work we do, but as sort of a metaphor, into the world, in the market at the right time with a great idea. And I never thought it literally would last that first meeting. And so over these 30 years, we have worked in countries with the same approach, the power of shared experience. I don't mean it in a kumbaya type way. It's not like we sit around in a circle and hold hands and talk about how we build empathy. It's more like a support group. We bring in people who have struggled with change at a leadership level, often people who try to kill each other. I mean, literally who led guerrilla movements or militaries or prime ministers or victims or top negotiators to sit down and say, this is what change looks like. It's difficult, but it's possible. Because what are the other options? And so, just a few highlights. I had the pleasure of getting to know Nelson Mandela. And he was on our advisory board. And he would say things that became almost sort of like motherhood and apple pie until you reflect what we're struggling with in this country. So he said when he came out of prison, I want a country and not just power. Keep in mind, a man who spent 27 years in prison, more than a decade in solitary confinement, you could argue had a right to be really angry. And yet, when he was coming out of prison, he was given a draft for the speech he gave to the world in 1990. And he gave it back to the speechwriter. And the speechwriter came back and said, comrade, that's what they were called in those days, you can't say this about F.W. de Klerk. And what Mandela had written as he was coming out of prison, F.W. de Klerk is an honorable man. And when the speechwriter said, you can't say that, your people have been struggling and suffering, he said, no. It's up to him to disprove it. So think of that. Think of that power of leadership, that power of vision, integrity, but it was a risk. And the reason why, this is my own theory, but I know a lot of people in South Africa who agree with me, is that Mandela and his wife didn't survive their marriage, not just because he had been away for 27 years, but one of the benefits, if you call it that, of being in prison for so long is a lot of time for reflection. Whereas if you're out in the world dealing with the reality of day-to-day apartheid, you don't have time for that. And so when he came back together, he had very little in common at a fundamental level with his wife. And that's why they ended up getting divorced. But more importantly, Mandela was making a message that not only do I want a country, and I'm going to reach across to de Klerk and say, he is an honorable man and it's up to him now to disprove it, that it's important to be tough on structures and institutions, not on people. Think of what's happening in this country today, on all sides. We're tough on people. We need to be tougher on those things that are depersonalized as much as possible. And these are some of the great lessons from leaders like Nelson Mandela. There's another interesting story about this, and I had a recent opportunity to bring Rolf Meyer, who was the chief negotiator in the talks to end apartheid for de Klerk, with Ibrahim Rasool, who had been one of the top ANC leaders, who until recently was the South African ambassador to the United States. And we're talking about what are the lessons learned from South Africa to the United States. And I took those two and another great man named Albie Sachs to actually a school John went to, Boston Latin School, 3 years ago. And, Black Lives Matter had emerged, and there was a lot of dissension on the campus about issues of racism and discrimination. And, here were particularly Albie Sachs, who lost an arm and an eye to an assassination attempt by the apartheid government in 1989. And he walks in and he meets with about 30 students before he speaks to the whole assembly. And these students were sitting around the table. They were young, and there were some activists of color who were saying things like, we can't have conversations until people declare their privileges. We can't have a conversation until people deconstruct their identities, the color of their skin, whiteness, and many other things. And Albie Sachs looked around the table, and I sat there very quietly, and he finally said to one woman, he said, you know, when you state that you're a victim, when you put on the table you're a victim, you're claiming a privilege. When you say you're a victim, you're taking on an entitlement. And they looked at him. Because when you are a victim, it's not your fault. It's not your responsibility. It's everybody else's responsibility. And he looked over at this young woman who was probably a freshman in high school. I think she was of a Latina background, and she was crying. And he said, I hate to put you on the spot, but have you ever felt privilege? And she says, well, I'm beginning to recognize my privilege, I'm lighter skinned and so forth. And he said, but what was your background? And she said, I didn't know my father. My mother died from a drug overdose. My grandmother took me in. She nurtured me, she mentored me, she saved me. I was able to come into this great school. And I'm learning things here that I don't know how to process. And he turned to these other students and said, she could be your ally, and instead, you're destroying her capacity to be an ally. And he said, you know, years before Mandela got out of prison, we came to realize in the African National Congress that we couldn't take power when the Afrikaner community felt completely shamed, stigmatized, and blamed collectively for apartheid. They weren't like the South Africans of a British background who had a passport in their back pocket. When things got bad, they could leave. They were the only white tribe of Africa. They had no country to go back for. Therefore, they're going to fight to the very end. So we spent time in the 80s at the national executive level of the ANC trying to understand why they would create a system like this. What trauma did they go through as a community? What did they experience? Ethnic cleansing and concentration camps that happened to them in the Boer War and before. What was that experience that allowed them and forced them to live and justify a system like that? And if we held them collectively responsible, then they wouldn't engage. And it was such a powerful moment because I realized what I and others did around the world was take people from other countries and bring them into a place like from South Africa to Northern Ireland to share those lessons. I had the benefit, you say, the privilege as an American to help set the table, sort of like a caterer, and bring into that moment people who had a story that could resonate with people in that country. And I sat there saying, and now it's happening in my country. Here are these South Africans and others saying, don't make the mistakes we made. We try to go from an us versus them mindset to one where we have more in common and that we're citizens of the same nation. And they've been saying to me for years, a lot of these leaders, you need to focus on your own country. And I'd be like, yeah, I know we have problems and so forth. And they were like canaries in a coal mine. They said, no, though. We can smell it and see it. We can see this happening. And if the United States goes off the tracks, we're all in trouble. Things could go very bad in big countries around the world. But it doesn't have the same standing globally as the United States. And we knew the United States was not perfect, but we also knew they set a set of principles. There was a certain integrity. When they spoke about the need to protect democracy and norms, it really meant something. And if we lose that globally, we're all in trouble. And so, over the years, what I've found is that these same profound messages and lessons that people could share with each other, goes back to this idea of a big support group, resonates here as powerfully and as importantly as it resonated elsewhere. So one of the things I wanted to mention is, I could tell you some other interesting anecdotes and stories about some other incredible people I've met with, or not met with and worked with. Maybe less famous than Nelson Mandela, but there are two people that I want to mention, and one of them transitions to some of the current work we're doing. So a really good friend of mine that John and Jane have met from Guatemala named Jose Maria Argueta. And John reminded me, he had lent me a book. If you remember the book Bel Canto, it was based on his experience. So he was the Guatemalan ambassador sent to Peru, and within 2 months of being in Peru, he was at the Japanese ambassador's residence for the birthday celebration of the emperor when the Tupac Amaru guerrillas stormed and took control. And because of his skills as a negotiator in the conflict in Guatemala, was able to negotiate with the guerrilla leadership in the embassy, and they let him go to then negotiate a surrender. But at the time, Fujimori and his Minister of Interior, Mene Montesinos, were like, oh, no, no, no. We're not going to do that. You know, there's too much pride here. That would show weakness. Remember the word about this? That's compromise. We don't do that. And so the then president, Fujimori, called the then president of Guatemala and said, take your ambassador home. So he ended up going home, and then within a month or two, they stormed the embassy and killed everybody. So one of the things he said to me early on when I met him in 1991 in El Salvador, we're driving from El Salvador to Guatemala. We're working in the peace process, and he said, you know, in my experience, all conflict is driven by exclusion. I thought, yeah, I kind of get that. I said, what do you mean? I sort of got it intellectually, politically, but he said, all conflict is driven by exclusion. When people cannot meet as individuals or families or communities their needs, they then ultimately could resort to violence or other methods. And I'll connect to some of the work we're doing with brain and behavioral science. And it just struck me, and over the years, like, wow, if there's one thing I've seen consistently around the world, is that often those most involved in conflict, and there are a lot of people who manipulate conflict. You know, I think of West Africa and many other places around resources, around just, you know, the pursuit of power. But in Northern Ireland, for example, or South Africa, and many other places, the Balkans, Bosnia, you know, there were some profound issues at play there. And exclusion was core to those conflicts. So move forward to about a decade ago. I'm teaching a class at Tufts University, and I called it Conflict Transformation in the 21st Century, the Human Dimension, because my thought was that most conflict resolution theory that had, is that my time up thing? No. Most conflict resolution theory that, in my humble opinion, really connected to the real world experience was quite thin. So every other class would have a speaker come in. So if you remember the name Gerry Adams from Northern Ireland, so Gerry Adams still says, unlike Martin McGuinness, who was the chief of staff of the Irish Republican Army, or the Provisional IRA, Gerry always said, no, 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 I was never a member. He was the head of the Belfast Brigade, among other things. And I had him come, and because we did a lot of work in the Northern Ireland peace process, and I had him come and speak to one of the classes. And the student said, so how do you sit across the table negotiating with somebody you may have tried to kill? You may have killed a member of their family, which did happen in that place among others, or they may have done the same to you. So Gerry paused in a thick North Belfast accent, which John could probably do. He said, you can't make peace with a humiliated partner. He says, you can't do it. you can't do it. And it just struck me at the time. I thought, wow. But at the end of the class, there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room. And he'd been sitting in on some of these classes. And he came up to me and said, you know, it's very interesting what Gerry Adams said about humiliation. And I heard somebody a couple weeks ago speak about empathy. He said, you know, there's a lot of brain science behind these emotions and processes. And I remember saying to him, what do you mean brain science? I understood social psychology. I understood from what I've seen in my own personal experience, and being a friend with John, I knew what that felt like. I told you, John. But I said, what does that actually mean? And he said, let me put it this way. It was really quite eloquent. He said, speaking as a scientist, we are not rational beings with emotions. At our core, it's just the opposite. We are emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood and valued by others. And he said, that's science. He said, the Enlightenment got a lot of stuff wrong. The Enlightenment, so I went back and, it's been a long time since I was in grad school. All right, the Enlightenment, what did it say? And one of the things the Enlightenment was predicated on was the emergence of science. That with the emergence of science, we could show that we can be these rational, reason-based individuals, that mythology and superstition or religion or other practices got in the way, and they will go with time. They will go the way of the dodo bird, that we'll see how we can be really based on reason, and by the way, the humans are superior to the rest of the world around us. And yet today, science is saying, no, 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 no. It's just the opposite. So we do a lot of work with MIT. And so we work with the Cognitive Sciences Department, and we work with the Political Science Department. And all the cognitive sciences say it is unethical that we are graduating PhDs in political science who are still taught that humans are rational actors. When we look at human behavior, we look at groups like the IRA versus the British government. We only look at individuals who are leaders as if leaders are inorganic entities. So within broader brain and behavioral science, not only do we look at individuals and look at their brains, a lot of them look even deeper at molecules or neurons in the brain. We don't need to go that far in our work. But the more I got into looking at brain and behavioral science, the more I stood back and said, holy crap. I said, yeah, the Enlightenment did get it wrong. And it began to explain a lot of things that I observed in my work around the world. So when my friend said to me 30 years ago, conflict is principally driven by exclusion, research shows that we experience social rejection in the same part of our brains that we experience physical pain. We are mammals, some more than others. And if you ever look at, you remember the old Mutual of Omaha? I love talking to a group that knows Mutual of Omaha. You remember the Wild Kingdom series? They'd show, the wildebeest and others moving in these great groups. And what do the predators do? The predators come and pick you off or pick them off one at a time. So they pick off one of those mammals, and it's a direct threat when you are killed and picked off by a predator to your survival. Our brains literally process it the same way. So when we get marginalized, excluded, humiliated, shamed, the same region of the brain comes online, and it's a direct physical threat. Same pain centers come online. And so the more we started getting into the science, started learning things like, scientists would say, focus on how we think, not what we think, because how we think is so deeply unconscious. That we think in groups. We think in mental models of the world, and we think automatically. Because we are all descendants of those ancestors who, looking out in the tall grass, saw the lion. Because if you didn't see the lion, you were literally eaten. So we are literally the descendants of those people where evolution has adapted us to be quick, to make predictions, to look in that environment and say, is that a threat or not? The other really important thing is scientists say our brains evolved to be predictive and not reactive. Because we're likely to survive if we predict, then I wonder if that's a threat, and we get killed instantly. And so we are living with brains that fundamentally haven't evolved in any major way in 35,000 years. And the more we got into this, the more we started to realize, wait a minute, we need to understand what's already known about what it is to be human and start applying that to issues of social conflict, social change, and just what it is to be humans trying to interact with each other. And so much of the science corresponds with so much of what we've seen around the world. And also what's really interesting is the science is also showing that context is one of the most important things in our lives. For our brain's ability to contextualize themselves and another person literally creates a connection. So look at the word empathy. So somebody said to me recently, so we want to promote radical empathy. I said, it's already done. It's called ISIS. Because what science tells us is that empathy is something that can be used for good and for bad. We can manage empathy, and sometimes we can't. And what empathy means is we can contextualize another's lived experience. And it's so context is important, proximity is important. And I'll give you a really good example. So a few years ago, I was giving a talk at Notre Dame. So like 300 students who were in conflict resolution studies. And I said, I'm going to show you some images, which I'm not doing to be voyeuristic or difficult. I wasn't quite aware of the word trigger warning, so I didn't give a trigger warning, but I sort of said, you need to be aware that I'm doing this to make a point. I said, all of the images I'm about to show you were on the front page of the New York Times above the fold from Syria. So the first one was an image early in the Syrian war of thousands of Syrians fleeing one of the neighborhoods of Damascus. It looked like it could have been a Hollywood epic. And I asked, who knows this image? Not a hand went up. The second image was of a father holding his dead son, surrounded by rubble, covered in dust. Do we know this image? No. Third image was a young girl who survived a bombing, bleeding. She was probably 4 years old. Do we know this image? No. Then I went to the fourth image, and it was a Turkish policeman picking up the body of a young boy who drowned on the beach. Do you remember that image a few years ago? And surrounded by a beautiful beach, around Labor Day, kid was dressed like he could have been playing in the pool. And like everybody here and everybody there and everywhere else I've talked, why do we know that image? Not just because it went viral because our brains accessed it in milliseconds. Because that could be us. That could be one of my children, one of my grandchildren, one of my neighbors. That's context. Proximity, that looks like it was down on Martha's Vineyard, or on the beach here, or at the pool. So our brain automatically accessed that image. The predictive brain said, that could be real, that could be here, and that's something I need to know about. So one of the things we're trying to do is, if we're going to talk about empathy, understand what it means. Too often people use the phrase empathy without realizing how it plays out in the brain. And so what we're doing in our work with brain and behavioral scientists is trying to unpack a lot of the current knowledge and then stimulate new knowledge that we can then translate to some major real-world issues. So I'm going to show you one quick...
You want me to follow on?
Yeah. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides. So as John said, I could have gone on for hours, but then I'd be here by myself. Which I often talk to myself. So we have started working not only with brain and behavioral scientists, we're working in this country, but some of the things we're doing, we want to use and deploy globally.
I'll advance for you.
Yeah, you can stay there for a second. So we started looking at polarization in the United States, and particularly looking at what we call toxic polarization. So it's obvious we're in a hyper-polarized country right now. And if you talk to political scientists and everybody else, and it's true, polarization, I used to say to people, conflict is inherent in human society. So it's not so much conflict resolution, it's conflict management mitigation. How do you manage conflict, or how do you understand the role that polarization plays in any society? When we started looking at this with brain and behavioral scientists, we started asking the question, are we becoming polarized to such a degree that it's becoming toxic, and it's more like a public health threat to our nation than just a partisan, intense fight over ideas and power? Is it becoming more of an us versus them mindset, like we've seen in other countries around the world? And if we care about our nation, I wear a civic hat before I wear any other hat. I care about this country. I want this country to thrive. And if we don't start thinking about it, we're in deep trouble. And so I just wanted to point this out. So I mentioned what the scientists say, focus on how we think, not what we think. And one of the things we did is, okay, there are a lot of polls. You can go online, you can read all of these more recent articles because of the election about polarization. We have been developing something that is novel, and we're creating a diagnostic tool to really look at how do we really understand what's happening through the lens of brain and behavioral science. So I mentioned that our brains evolved to be predictive, and when you predict, there's a certain degree of error. So there's also a dynamic of meta-perceptions or meta-misperceptions. If we are distant from others, we're constantly predicting or responding to what we think of the others based on what we hear from our networks, our social groups, or more media, whether it be online or on television. So, next slide. Thanks. So here's what I wanted to do. Show you quickly. For the last year, we've done 4 national surveys. And we went to a group of people self-identified as Democrats and Republicans, and we asked on issues that are very contentious, where are you as a Democrat and on this issue? So border security. So here's what we did. We went to Democrats and Republicans and said to Democrats, where do you think you are and other Democrats are on the issue of open borders? Turns out the majority of them are somewhere in the middle. We say, where do you think Republicans are on open borders? Completely closed. We then go to Republicans and say, where do you think you and other Republicans are on open borders? The majority is sort of in the middle. We then say, where do you think the Democrats are? They want them completely open. So on open borders, on guns, on abortion, and 3 or 4 other big police violence, we ask the question, and what we're finding is that there is a massive gap in what people think the other side thinks about these issues, by at least double. So then, if you go, Chris, a little bit, so that just shows you, let me see if you go, I'm sorry, go back one more. See that you can see, you know, where majority are in the, sort of in the middle, the median. If you go to the next one, this is what people think is going on. Now, if you please go to the next, and by the way, that misperception clouds our reality. If we think we're that far away from the other side, why should we talk to them? Now, if you go to the next one, now here's something on dehumanization. So several years ago, we started doing research on how our brain processes dehumanization. What is dehumanization? It's literally to see people as less than human. And I won't bore you with some of the science, but it's really interesting. If you go online, by the way, to Beyond Conflict, we have a policy brief on dehumanization, which is really interesting. So we came up with this ascent of man scale. It's pretty blunt. Sorry, John. John is the second one in from the left. But most of you know that. Okay. So we literally, on a scale of 0 to 100, and we've done this in 13 countries around the world, ask people, where would you place this other group in terms of how human they are? So when we did it in Colombia recently, looking at the peace process, Colombian citizens rate the FARC, you remember the guerrilla movement, at 44%, which means they see them as not even human, which doesn't surprise me, because when I used to work in Northern Ireland and other countries, I talked to some of the unionist political leaders or Ian Paisley's political leaders about Sinn Féin and their political leaders. They would literally use words, they're not human. And it's not just metaphoric. They really didn't think they were human. So here's what we did. We asked Democrats and Republicans on a scale of 0 to 100, how would you place the other side? They both place each other between 18 and 17 points, which is disturbing. But then if you go to the next slide, we then ask them, Democrat and Republican, how much do you think the other side dehumanizes you? It's up nearly 50 points. So if you think they not just discriminate against me or don't like me or they're prejudiced against me, but if they do not see me as human and it's that high, I will never speak to them. Then the us versus them mindset really takes off in a deeply dangerous way. And so what we've been doing is trying to unpack, are we as polarized as we think we are? Or do we think we are actually far more polarized because of the way our media operates, the way social media operates, the way we live more clustered away from each other. There's something about social distancing. 30 years ago, if you asked, white family, would you have a problem if one of your children married somebody of the other color? That was a big issue. Today, it's not that. It's Republicans don't want their family members, literally, to marry a Democrat and vice versa.
That was an issue for me 46 years ago.
Yeah. It's a shame they still feel that way. Okay. So what we're trying to do is unpack this and actually frame it as what it really is. So if we are truly less divided than we think, then there's hope for change. And some of the researchers we've been working with Harvard and NYU find that when you just correct people's misperceptions, it actually there's a cognitive shift. It changes how they engage and think of the other side. So, I with friends and other people have said, if I said to you, Jay, John really can't stand you. He really can't. You're like, wow, I didn't know that, right? I thought he liked me. Unless you're like deeply into meditation and Zen and really, very sort of grounded, thinking that he thinks about you differently than you imagine would change a bit of how you think about him, right? So think of that on a broader scale. And so what we're trying to do is create a national heat map. Think of it in a public health way, is if we can really unpack this, then how do we communicate this? So that's just an example of some of the stuff we're doing. And with that, I'm getting the call it quits look. And thank you.